I must say it's a surprise and a pleasure for me to be here at the Frick. It feels a little bit like déjà vu, I think, because this is an institution that is hallowed in our profession for its great Western art. And the only Asian objects that you'll notice in the galleries are the Chinese porcelain set in ormolu that Mr. Frick acquired, many of them, by the way, from J.P. Morgan, who sold his collection. His collection was sold after Morgan died in 1913. We had hoped they'd come to the Met, I guess. But I think it's really a wonderful opportunity for us to examine the role of East Asian art in the West, especially as it is embodied in the history of the Metropolitan Museum. The Met was founded in 1870, and it was very much according to the wishes of its founders that the museum become an encyclopedic presentation of world culture. And that has been the guiding spirit of our acquisitions, but actually to a much greater degree, I would say, uniquely, the Met's Asian collections are a reflection of the fact that New York is a melting pot, and the variety of prominent and passionate private collectors that have passed through this city in the last 140 years has really been the most of the impetus behind the shape of the Metropolitan's now encyclopedic collections. Before I start, I also want to just take an opportunity to acknowledge my own learning curve in the historiography of Asian art. It is really thanks to Warren Cohen and his terrific book on East Asian art and its impact on American culture that was really the starting point or genesis for this symposium. Also, I've learned a lot from Calvin Tompkins' book on merchants and masterpieces at the Met. Julia Meach has contributed a number of articles on the collecting of Japanese prints, the Havemeyers and Harry Packard at the Met. And a number of people in the Asian art department have also been terrific in providing me with information about our own collection, Joyce Denny, Sinead Keogh, and Xin Wang amongst them. So my heartfelt thanks to all of those members of the field. What I realized in tackling this topic is that there are many ways to describe the history of the museum. And of course, one of the fundamental ways one can envision history is through the architectural expansion, the physical presence of the Met in New York from 1872, when it occupied this brownstone on Fifth Avenue and 53rd Street, to 1880, when Calvert Vaux's Ruskin Gothic building anchored the museum's position in Central Park. Oops, sorry. What is extraordinary is that by that moment, in 1880, when the Vaux building was first opened to the public, that already there was a plan afoot to create a museum. This is the part you see here, that envisioned this vast museum complex that the first director of the museum, Luigi Palma di Cesnola, who had just started a year before in 1879, commented here presciently, "View of the whole building when completed in 1990. Well, he was right. In 1990, the Met completed the last wing, and 110 years later, we finally occupied the footprint that was mapped out in 1880, albeit with a lot more empty spaces than we left in the building as it is today. But in addition to the physical expansion of the museum, it is the collectors who made the contents of that building so important. That is really, I think, the narrative that I want to stress today is at least one chapter in this story about collecting East Asian art in America. The first Asian art to come to the museum arrived in 1879 when one of its trustees, Samuel P. Avery, offered the museum 1,100 ceramics, over 1,000 of which looked like this. They were 18th and 19th century Qianlong and Daoguang era polychrome ceramics, and this is how they were housed by 1907. So it was really these private collectors that were very significant early contributors to the shape and direction of the museum's collections. Another trustee by the name of Stephen Whitney Phoenix in 1883, who donated something like 325 Japanese works of art, including a number of Japanese lacquers, such as this 18th century cabinet. And a wonderful story, a third trustee, Charles Stewart Smith, on honeymoon in Japan in 1893, just up and shipped to the Met directly 522 porcelains that he and his third wife acquired while they were in Japan. They never even bothered to put them in their home. They sent them directly to the Met. And Louise Court, who will be talking to us about the Frears collection tomorrow, has pointed out to us just how fortunate we are that thanks to trustees and collectors like Smith, the Met now has perhaps the most comprehensive collection of Nabeshima wares outside of Japan. Here's a wonderful example, as well as Hirado wares, so that these things willy-nilly found their way to the museum almost as an afterthought if somebody said, oh, let's pick up a few souvenirs for the Met while we're here. A totally different kind of collection came to the Met in 1891 with Edward Moore, who was employed by Tiffany's and who was the head of their silver design department. When he died in 1891, he presented the museum with over 2,000 works of art that he had collected really as a working collection to inform his own designs. And of course, the exotic East was a very big inspiration, so he formed enormous collections. There was something like 700 mostly Japanese textiles, ceramics, metalwork, and baskets that came to the museum in 1891. And one of them happens to be a rare signed example of one of the earliest known 19th century craftsmen that was recently discovered. So 100 years later, we're finally learning what we have. Now, the pragmatic collecting of works of art to inform American craftsmen was one of the founding principles of the Met's charter. And this interest in well-crafted design was something that certainly would have appealed to the Met's great trustee president, J.P. Morgan. Morgan became a member of the trustees in 1888, remained so until 1913, and for the last decade of his life, he served as the museum's trustee president. And he would have, he was a collector with terrifically broad interests. He focused not only on medieval art, of course, books and manuscripts, but who would have thought that he would have acquired a dozen rhinoceros horn cups from the 17th century, all of which he donated to the museum in 1908. But that interest in craftsmanship was very much part of his aesthetic. Now, it was under Morgan the museum's spaces really began to transform themselves. He joined the museum trustees in 1888 when Theodore Western's 1888 wing had just been completed. It's located here, adjacent to the original building. 1894, yet another wing, a parallel wing, was built here. But then in 1902, the museum opened up this grand Richard Morris Hunt main entrance hall, obviously planning to expand and bringing the entrance right down to Fifth Avenue. And it was also under Morgan that McKim, Mead, and White designed a 4-block-long facade for the museum. Of course, the same firm was also building the Morgan Library, which was completed in 1906. So Morgan's influence and the bringing together of this new architectural style away from the Gothic and moving towards the classical was very much part of his vision for the museum. And so it was really under his direction that the museum completed this new set of wings just a few years after he died in 1913. By 1918, the museum had already taken on that form. More than half of the Morgan collection was actually sold after his death to pay for death duties. But in spite of that, his son, J.P. Morgan Jr., was still able to donate over 6,000 works of art to the Met shortly after his father's death. And part of the Morgan collection included such extravagant things as his 1690 Kangxi Coromandel screen, which played a prominent part in the display of Asian art, which was right on the balcony around the Great Hall. So this is the shape of the museum about 1920. This was really envisioned by Morgan, and for the next 50 years, the museum's physical footprint did not change. All the changes that took place after 1920 took place inside this building. And it was a number of New York collectors in particular who were responsible for building the collections and giving them this new shape. And many of them were self-made men. This is Heber Bishop, He was born in Ipswich, Massachusetts, and he started investing in sugar, and he switched to iron ore and railroads, and it became his passion to reconstruct the Qing imperial collection of jades. It was coming on the market after 1860 when the Yuanmingyuan Summer Palace was destroyed and looted. And he nearly succeeded. He built a collection of more than 1,000 pieces of 18th and 19th century jade, including this wonderful 1774 wine basin. Sue Valenstein always referred to it as the baby bassinet, so it was appropriate to put the baby there too. But Bishop's collecting taste was not at all informed by the later archaeological discovery of primitive, or I should say Neolithic through Shang, Zhou, and Han Dynasty jades. He was of the Gilded Age, and you can see that in the opulent display methods that he advocated for the museum. This is how the collection was displayed in 1903 with his original cases and a reproduction of his Louis XV ballroom, which is how he displayed them in his own home. So this opulence, I'm sure, would have appealed to the Qianlong Emperor, and would have been right at home, I think, with the Frick and the other members of the Gilded Age as well. Another self-made man was B. Altman. Benjamin Altman started his life as a son of Bavarian immigrants who came to this country in 1853. By 1870, he was already working in dry goods, and of course eventually built B. Altman and Company, one of the great department stores of the Met with its flagship store at 34th Street and 5th Avenue. Altman was a reclusive man. He never married, but he built an impressive collection of old master paintings and over 400 Chinese ceramics, mostly monochromes of the very highest quality. And all of these things came to the Met when he died in 1913. A very different kind of trustee involved in the Met's history was this man, Howard Mansfield. He was a prominent lawyer who was an avid collector of Japanese art and Whistler paintings, obviously part of that circle of people who was influenced by Whistler and Japanisme in Paris at the time. And he really played the role of curator before the museum had a curator of Asian art. He was very instrumental in bringing together a number of collections that were bought at auction, including he purchased 300 prints from the Spalding collection. The other 7,000 ended up at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, but the duplicates he was able to cull, and I hope Christine Guth will tell us more about some of these early Japanese print collectors in her talk tomorrow. It was certainly Mansfield who was influential in engaging John Ferguson to be a representative of the Met to help it form a comprehensive collection of Chinese painting and artifacts in 1912. Ferguson was a missionary who'd come to China in the late 19th century, but he was very much instilled with the spirit of traditional Chinese literati. And so he did something quite remarkable. In less than 1 year, he was able to put together a collection of some 300 works of art, which he sold to the Met. He actually was fronted money from the Metropolitan Museum, included things that were particularly in Chinese literati taste. All of the bronzes were those which have inscriptions rather than elaborate decor. But most uniquely of all, he purchased almost 200 Chinese paintings, and many of these were Ming and Qing dynasty paintings, which had been completely ignored or eschewed by people like Charles Freer, who only wanted works of Song dynasty. And so, in addition to the paintings, Ferguson was also the first American collector to pay any attention to calligraphy. A number of the fans that are in the Ferguson collection bear important inscriptions. This one is by Yang Wensong. It's a painting by the Ming artist Xie Shichen, a pupil of Shenzhou. So while many of the early attributions, Gu Kaizhi, Yan Liben, have been demonstrated to be awful forgeries, it is true that many of these things that were acquired over 100 years ago now, or almost 100 years, still stand up with modern connoisseurship. So Ferguson was really ahead of his time in the way he collected. So with all of this activity, with all of this interest in adding to the collection of Asian art, finally the museum got around to creating an independent department in June of 1915, and they immediately hired Sigisbert de Chrétien Bosch-Reitz as its first curator. Bosch-Reitz was from Amsterdam. He had been trained as a painter in Munich and Paris, where he had won a certain amount of acclaim. But quite interestingly, he also spent a year in Japan in 1900, where, among other things, he studied woodblock printing and actually made some himself. By 1909, he was studying Chinese ceramics. So in 1914, the Louvre offered him a position to catalog its Asian collections. But the beginning of the First World War made that appointment impossible. He came to New York, and shortly thereafter, he was engaged to be the museum's curator. So Old Dutch Cleanser, as he was fondly known in the museum, was regarded as somebody who was meticulous in all that he did, particularly in his displays, and he was really quite extraordinary in the number of masterpieces he was able to put together. This is a portrait dated to around 1056, typical of the kind of figurative art that was being collected in this day and age, that he acquired in 1917, just less than 2 years after he began at the museum. Then there was a whole group of early Chinese sculptures. We'll hear more about that from Stanley Abe tomorrow with the earliest collecting in America. But by 1919, the Met was able to acquire this wonderful dry lacquer 7th to 8th century Buddha of the Tang Dynasty, a northern way, figure of a bodhisattva from Yungang. This great pair of Lohans from the Liao Dynasty around the year 1000. Great late 5th century gilt bronze Buddha, and a Japanese Dainichi Nyorai came in 1925 and 1926. He also expanded the museum's holdings of antiquities. This is a unique set of bronze vessels from the late Shang, early Zhou dynasty that was formerly in the collection of Duanfang, one of the great Manchu viceroys, who was also an avid collector and a friend of Ferguson. And in fact, this came to the museum in 1924 through the efforts of John Ferguson. Boschreitz also collected textiles, including some of the early No robes in the collection. The storytelling exhibition that's on view at the Met today highlights the 5 hand scrolls that document the Kitano engine shrine's history. So this is one of the great coups that also arrived in the early 1920s, and also Korin's rough waves of around 1705. So here is a way in which Japanese art was displayed by the Old Dutch Cleanser around 1928, just about the time he retired. We see the Korin in the background and the 14th century Kitano Tenjin hand scroll in the foreground. And this is a loan from John D. Rockefeller Jr., who was an important supporter of the Met at that time. Now, while Boschreitz was acquiring works of art for the museum by purchase, there were also great private collections that were being built in New York at the time, perhaps none more fabled than that of H.O. Havemeyer, who made a fortune in refining and importing sugar. He was known as the Sugar King, and his second wife, Louisine, who outlived him by some 20 years, only dying in 1929, were avid collectors of Impressionist paintings through the intercession of their friend Mary Cassatt, who was a very influential big influence on them, often hosted them when they visited Paris. And because the Impressionist painters were also fascinated with Japanese prints, the Havemeyers naturally gravitated into collecting Japanese prints as well, such as this Udamaro, which was clearly influential in the print style that Mary Cassatt herself adopted. So figurative art was also an important part of their acquisition. They were intrigued with the Asian art, which they decorated their home with more as a kind of exotic trappings, I would say, than true knowledge. A lot of the attributions have changed. In fact, we now believe this painting, which was acquired as a Japanese work of art, is now a Koryo painting, very rare indeed. One of the amazing things about the Havemeyer collection is the terms by which it was given to the museum. Louisine herself donated 142 paintings, prints, and this sculpture to the museum outright in her will, but she left the bulk of the collection to her son Horace with the stipulation that he could use his own discretion as to how to dispose of the rest of the collection. Happily for the Met, the 1,972 other things that were in the Havemeyer collection came through Horace's good offices shortly thereafter with no conditions and no restrictions. So it was an enormous infusion of very important material, mostly European, but with a great many Asian things as well. Now imagine being hired in 1928 the year before this bequest lands on your doorstep. What a great boon for a curator. So Alan Priest was the lucky man who received that boon. He was a Harvard graduate student at the time. He was only 30 years old. He stayed at the Met for another 35 years, leaving an indelible imprint on the museum's history. He was someone who had been on 2 expeditions to China with Langdon Warner. He'd come recommended by Paul Sachs, the great connoisseur of European drawings. But it turned out that Priest was something of a character. He was noted for his eccentric behavior. He often arrived very late in the day and stayed late at night. He loved to play practical jokes. And he also had this penchant for buying what he liked and ignoring the rest. So it was a very uneven approach to the collecting. Happily, one of the things that he was most fond of was Chinese sculpture, and that he did a brilliant job of acquiring in just the first decade of his tenure as a curator, from 1928 to 38. He acquired these 2 early 6th century Northern Way gilt altarpieces, great Tang Dynasty pair of Bodhisattva, a very important dated Yuan Dynasty Avalokiteshvara 1282. A whole suite of sculptures carved in wood, so moving beyond sculptures in bronze to expand the collection in the direction of the Sung and later, were one of the hallmarks of his collection. And it's important to note that although Priest was often dealing directly with China in some of his acquisitions, the role of dealers in New York and in Europe at this time was really very significant. This is C.T. Lu, here seated in his gallery. On the right-hand side of the hand of God, you might say. This is the hand of Buddha from Shangtangshan that he actually donated to the museum in 1930 in appreciation for the museum's business. Yamanaka and Company from Kyoto is also a very important conduit for Asian art during the teens, 20s, and 30s, and right down into the early 50s. In fact, these 2 enormous sculptures came to the Met only in 1954. And they were part of C.T. Lu's legacy. It was actually transferred to Frank Caro, another dealer at that time. So the Met kept acquiring these sculptures even after access to mainland China itself was closed. Another great source of sculpture for the museum was Abby Aldridge Rockefeller. She was not only the inspiration behind the 1929 founding of the Museum of Modern Art, but she had, as part of the encyclopedic collecting of many of these private individuals, acquired a wonderful selection of some 54 Asian works that she later donated to the museum, including 14 early Chinese sculptures. Now, one of Priest's other passions was costumes and textiles, and one of his most famous attributes was he was a great showman. He had this theatrical touch in the way he presented these works of art. He acquired these 2 No robes from the Louis Ledoux collection in 1932 in time to incorporate them into a grand exhibition of No robes and Buddhist vestments that he mounted in 1935, and you can see the lengths to which he went to display them. Here is a kind of simulation of a No stage, and you have a whole procession of Buddhist monks walking over the Uji Bridge here in one of the Met's galleries. Another one of his fabulous exhibitions was mounted in 1945. It was costumes from the Forbidden City. And you can imagine putting this right in the Great Hall, one of the great lunettes there, welcoming people into the exhibition, and where he had this wonderful knack of showing robes in animated poses as well. I'm sure the conservators are all cringing at the idea of how these things are presented. But what really left people agog was the way he presented the tomb of the Guoqin Wang, one of the sons of the Kangxi Emperor who died in 1738. A number of those robes came into the Met and Kansas City's collection in the 30s, and this is a portrait actually of Guoqin Wang that's now in the Nelson Atkins collection. But in Priest's vivid imagination, he put the Guoqin Wang in his tomb chamber with attendant concubines weeping over his corpse. And of course, the corpse itself was provided by a gold-painted skeleton. When the Met director, Francis Taylor, saw this, he said, "The skeleton must go." Well, it went, but Priest snuck it back in before the opening, and it created such a sensation that Taylor was helpless and had to leave it there. I love the insouciant grasp of the Rui scepter that the skeleton is posed with. So you can see that Priest had this wonderful and somewhat irreverent approach to Chinese and Japanese art, and certainly in its display mode. Well, there were more than one skeleton in the closet left by Priest as well, and one of the most prominent was his 1947 acquisition of 142 paintings from the dealer A.W. Barr. Priest must have been trying to play catch-up for all of the great painting acquisitions that had been made by Boston, by Freer, by Kansas City by this time. Cleveland was already beginning to collect. So in one fell swoop, he acquired this collection. Unfortunately, only 10% of the paintings are now considered exhibitable. This is the first painting in that group. He considered it his great coup, and he mounted an exhibition, the Spring Festival Along the River, in 1948. He called it a Ming copy of a Song painting. Today, we would probably label it as late 18th century. But out of the 14 works that were actually important in that group, there are some really major examples: a Buddhist sutra from the Dali Guo presented to the Northern Song court in 1119, and a unique work by Zhou Dongqing from early Yuan dynasty, 1291. So out of all of that, still, we've been able to salvage some really important works. So Priest actually, I would say, he sort of partially made up for his unwise purchase of the Barr collection en masse. 2 years later, when the Louis Ledoux collection of Japanese prints became available, Priest was assiduous in picking all of the early prints, such as the 1708 Kabuki Actor, and 19 works by Shoraku, giving the Met an extraordinary presentation of some of the rarest Japanese prints around. He also, in the early 50s, took advantage of the post-war opportunities to buy Japanese art by acquiring Ogata Korin's fabled iris screens in 1953 and Kitsu's Morning Glories of just the following year. In 1953, he also, the Met was one of a group of museums that welcomed a collection of important national treasures from Japan itself. Was highlighted here as Alan Priest looking on with some of the Japanese couriers as things were being unpacked. But it's significant, I think, that in 1961, when the Met was one of 5 museums to host treasures from the National Palace Museum in Taiwan, the Priest's name was not mentioned in the catalog. Instead, Ashwin Lippi, a young curator who joined the museum staff in 1949, was responsible for representing the Met and helping with the selection and the installation. So clearly, after 1947, Priest was no longer eager or willing or able to really engage with Chinese painting on a serious level. Now, what's interesting to me is that in that 1961 catalog, Douglas Dillon, who was then Secretary of the Treasury, was mentioned as one of the members of the honorary committee. And that was really prescient because 4 years later, when Dillon again became a trustee at the Met, he had served in the 50s as well, and went on to be active trustee for 20 years and another 20 years as an honorary trustee. Dillon was the guiding force behind reanimating the Asian collection at the Met. It was under Dillon that the museum celebrated its centennial in 1970. And it was at that time that Tom Hoving, the director, and Dillon created a master plan for completing the vision of the Met as it had been laid out 100 years earlier. And we can see that this is the 1920 look of the museum, and all of the area that's left blank here is now filled out with these glass-covered wings. So that was very much part of Dillon's contribution to the museum's history. But more significantly, Dillon and Hoving at the centennial really questioned what the mission of the Metropolitan should be for the next 100 years. In essence, they said, should the museum simply be dedicated to those areas where it has strength and abandon the rest of the world, or should it rededicate itself to becoming a truly encyclopedic museum? At the time they did a survey of the curatorial departments, the Asian art department was the weakest in staff, collections, and gallery space. The only space for Asian art in the entire building was the balcony around the Great Hall and this one room of early Buddhist sculpture. That was Asian art at the Met in 1970. So the year after the centennial, Tom Hoving invited his Princeton classmate, Wen Fong, to join the staff to rejuvenate Asian art, both in the building and in the field. And for the next 3 decades, Wen Fong and Douglas Dillon became an extraordinary dynamic duo that really transformed the institution's ability to show Japanese, Chinese, and all of Asian art. Wen Fong's quick answer to the museum's dilemma was, you cannot afford to buy individual works of art. You have to go after whole collections. So in 1973, the museum acquired 25 Sung Yuan paintings from C.C. Wong. Just 2 years later, the Harry Packard collection, some 700 works of art, was acquired. This was really an extraordinary feat, because in order to acquire that, Tom Hoving asked all of the curators at the Met to vote whether they would give up 5 years of unrestricted purchase funds in order to make this one purchase. The vote was yes. So in one fell swoop, the museum became the repository of a very comprehensive group of the whole collection, the whole sweep of Japanese art from Neolithic times, Jomon, Yayoi, right down to the 18th, 19th century. Another great benefactress of the museum at this time was Brooke Astor. Because she had spent her childhood in Beijing, she remembered fondly Chinese courtyard architecture, and she helped the museum acquire this suite of Ming-style furniture in 1975. And then, to create a period room setting for that furniture, we discovered that a light well to the first floor would actually be a beautiful courtyard space surrounded by Chinese galleries. And indeed, the flanking galleries were devoted to Chinese paintings. These were opened in 1981. At the time, the Met did not own enough exhibitable Chinese paintings to rotate the collection even once. But that was part of Dillon and Fong's daring, because they knew that on 82nd Street lived a man named John Crawford. When John walked into the galleries, he said, "At last, a space big enough to show my collection." And he made arrangements to give and leave his extraordinary collection of 227 Chinese paintings and calligraphies to the Met. This is the opening of an exhibition where there was a wonderful symposium as well in 1984 to celebrate the Crawford gift. And it's really transformative. It is really national treasure quality material, especially for the early period. Another important collection that Wen Fong was helping to build with John Elliott's help was also partially came to the Met, partially went to Princeton. In 1981, a group of 44 paintings from the Elliott family collection came to the Met. It highlights some of these early Buddhist paintings and early Ming literati works of art, and a great Taoist painting by Wu Bo Li. So happily, there were these collections in the offings that could help augment the museum's holdings. In 1986, the dealer Robert Ellsworth donated 480 of his 19th and 20th century paintings to the Met, including this wonderful 1965 splashed ink and color landscape by Zhang Daqin. And in 1989, a joint purchase and gift from Wango Wang brought to the museum an extraordinary group of Ming and Qing paintings and early calligraphies that had been formed by his 5th generation ancestor, Wang Tonghe, the end of the Qing dynasty, being the last and perhaps the only surviving example of late Qing collecting taste to make it into the 20th century. Meanwhile, the Japanese galleries were being planned with the support of the Japanese government and a consortium of Japanese companies. We happily were able to open the galleries in 1987. And in the 11,000 square feet of the new Japanese galleries, you see the Bosch Wright's Dainichi Nyorai from 1926 acquisition, a 1929 acquisition from the Havemeyers, The Life of Prince Shotoku, that's on view now in Storytelling, the 1953 acquisition of irises from Alan Priest's day, and finally this wonderful Kano Sansetsu old plum fusuma that was installed in a simulation of the abbot's quarters from the Packard collection, which was curated in part by Wen Fong and mostly by Julia Meach. Just a year later, in 1988, the museum opened its galleries of ancient China. John and Charlotte Weber were the collector patrons who enabled us to once again show our enormously important collection of early Tang through Yuan Ming sculptures, and at the same time to bring out the archaeological material that had been in the galleries but off view for decades. In addition to what had been there already, however, the Met had really fallen behind at a time when the Freer, Kansas City, Cleveland, and certainly Grenville Winthrop, who had lived across the street but whose collection went to Harvard in 1948, Met had fallen behind in the collection of this kind of material. But happily, Ernest Erickson, when he heard about the plan for the galleries, was very pleased to donate his 150 works of art, including marvelous Shang bronzes, great late Joe jade carving, to augment what we had in our permanent holdings to really make a difference in that area. Also, the Webers themselves helped to acquire works of art dating from the Neolithic through the Tang to augment what was there, really to create a more comprehensive picture of the archaeological world of early China. Then in 1997, just 16 years after the Met had opened its Chinese painting galleries, the collection had grown so significantly that the museum actually, we expanded the galleries and completely renovated them, updated the technology, including using things like non-reflective glass. This is a gallery donated by Oscar Tang, who's shown here with C.C. Wong, from whom he helped the museum to acquire another dozen early Chinese paintings, thanks also to the support of Philippe de Montebello and Wen Fong. There was enough space above the Francis Young Tang Gallery to accommodate a third floor, and it was there that the museum was able at last to display some of its later collections of decorative arts and marvelous textiles in the collection, and that was really thanks to Florence and Herb Irving, and also to the curatorship of James Watt, who had joined the staff in 1985 in time to help shape the Weber collection and the ancient China galleries. But over the next 25 years and in the last more than a decade as chairman of the department, James's contributions really focused on the later decorative arts of China. He was the principal author of the catalog of the Irving collection of Chinese, Japanese, and Ryukyuan and Korean lacquers. But he also helped the museum to acquire a wide range of decorative arts, including 14th century silver, early Ming cloisonné, and this marvelous scroll box from the Yongle period. Perhaps his greatest achievement was to assemble a remarkable collection of early Chinese textiles, the pièce de résistance of which is this 8-foot-tall mandala that had been commissioned by 2 of the Yuan emperors in the early 1330s. Now, while Chinese and Japanese art were growing apace, we didn't neglect India and Southeast Asia. The Irvings were particularly fond of that art and had a number of pieces in their own collection, and so the Irving galleries of South and Southeast Asian art opened in 1994. And in 1998, we opened galleries for the arts of Korea. With that set of galleries opening, the museum finally expanded from its early days of having art only on the balcony and in this hall to creating a whole wing, something like 50 rooms devoted to Asian art. It's really a museum within a museum for the opportunity to really tell the full history of Asian art as it's meant to be seen in a appropriate cultural context. But of course, once you've opened these galleries, you realize how many holes are left to fill. The curator's dilemma is such, and happily the tradition of philanthropy has continued with people such as Marie-Hélène and Guy Weil, who promised and donated a group of important Ming and Qing paintings, Wen Zheming's masterpiece, Living Aloft, and this is Dai Bun Xiao's Pines of Mount Tiantai, that came in 2001. In 2005, we were fortunate to acquire 2 great collections, one from the family of Lin Yutang, whose own works of art and those of his contemporaries were donated by members of his son and grandchildren, including a group of Xu Beihong that had been on display at the Met in 1943 during the Second World War. The same year, Sarah Shea donated over 300 sketches from her father, Xie Zhiliu, who's shown here and looking at a painting in the Met storeroom in 1984. These are extraordinarily important and rare because they show the process by which artists planned out their works of art meticulously before executing them in a finished version with colors on silk. So a great study collection. Most recently, Richard Fishbein and Estelle Bender have donated these 3 wonderful Edo paintings by Shohaku, Rosetsu, and this great 19th century screen of crows and egrets, together with a promised gift of 42 other Edo works of art. So at long last, Japanese art is beginning, I think, a resurgence, a renaissance at the Met. And that has been helped along by curatorial purchases. When Mieko Murase was still here in 2002, she had James Watt's support to buy a very important set of 3 14th century hand scrolls, a late tale for a late autumn evening. And most recently, John Carpenter, who's just joined our staff this summer as the latest curator of Japanese art, found this final fragment of the 3 scrolls in Tokyo just this year, and we were able finally to complete the entire set. So these kinds of acquisitions have brought us down to the 20th century and 21st century, I have to say, inspired by collectors like Uli Zig and Jane Debevoise, who will be joining us tomorrow. The Met has now begun to collect, importantly, works of art that relate to traditional Chinese and Japanese art history, but are very much part of the modernist ethos. This is Zhang Yu's abstraction from 2000. 2001, a stainless steel rock by Wang Zhan, and this wonderful taxidermy deer, pixel deer, was made just last year and acquired shortly after it was completed the presentation at Japan Society's Bye Bye Kitty. Now, in addition to acquiring works of art, whether through donation or through purchase, the Met in the last 4 decades has also made a renewed commitment to scholarship. We have published in the last 4 decades over 80 publications, many of which, 37 in fact, are devoted to the permanent collection, catalogs and monographic treatments, coming right down to Denise Leidy's recent treatment of the museum's collection of early Buddhist sculpture. We've also published 14 bulletins on various aspects of the permanent collection. We've hosted and published catalogs on 23 different topics over the last several decades. We've done 6 symposia and a number of teachers' education resources and videos, including our latest contribution to a new technology is an iPad book on the Buncheong ceramics that were here just last fall. But none of this would have been possible without the extraordinary collaboration of dealers, collectors, curators, and educators, and their commitment to making Asian art fully a part of the museum's narrative of world culture. It's really this collection of passionate individuals whose shared belief that the culture of all countries is really our shared heritage of humanity that has been the heart and soul of the Metropolitan Museum, and I believe all great museums. Thank you.